There is another very important phase of warfare. It has as its target not the body, but the mind of the enemy.
On infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
So let's continue going through our list of historic government conspiracies. Tonight, let's take a look inside the U.S. military plot to incite a war with Cuba, Operation Northwoods. So, Operation Northwoods called for the CIA to attack U.S. military personnel and civilians so they could blame it on Cuba's regime. In the early 1960s, the United States turned an increasingly nervous eye south, where communist leader Fidel Castro, well, he had just risen to power in Cuba, and so, determined to end his reign, the United States government came up with several false flag attacks under the banner of Operation Northwoods. The classified plan, organized under the umbrella of the Anti-Castro Cuba Project, or Operation Mongoose, well, it proposed a number of ways that the United States could fake a Cuban attack against America as a way to justify U.S. military intervention in said country. Military leaders suggested staging attacks at Guantanamo Bay, sinking ships full of Cuban refugees, and even staging the shooting down of a civilian aircraft. However, Operation Northwoods was more than just idle scheming. It was a concrete plan co-signed by the Joint Chief of Staff and presented to the office of President John F. Kennedy. This is the story of Operation Northwoods. By 1959, Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States were nearing a fever pitch, and it was at this moment that Fidel Castro came on the scene. And then in 1959, the communist revolutionary Fidel Castro overthrew the United States-backed Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista, and therefore established Cuba as the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. Americans, who were accustomed to worrying about the distant threat of the USSR, suddenly had a communist country just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Cold War, it seemed, could get hot. One should not forget, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev said in July 1960, driving the point home, and I quote again, that now the United States is no longer at an unreachable distance from the Soviet Union as it was before, end of quote. And from that statement, U.S. policymakers got the message, and so, as they publicly declared that the world would not tolerate international communism in the Western Hemisphere, intelligence organizations got to work behind the scenes. American intelligence first set out to neutralize the Castro threat, with of course the Bay of Pigs attack in 1961, which at the time was developed under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. However, when that plan failed, U.S. military leadership decided that it was their turn. In 1962, one particular individual, General Edward Lonsdale, the chief of operations for the Anti-Castro Cuba Project, or more commonly known as Operation Mongoose, well, he asked the Joint Chief of Staff for, and I quote, for a brief, however precise, description of pretexts which would provide justification for military intervention in Cuba, end of quote. And so, in response, the Joint Chief of Staff, led by General Leominster, well, they produced Operation Northwoods. And so on March 13, 1962, they presented Operation Northwoods to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, which was actually approved by the Joint Chief of Staff, and the document in question outlined a number of ways that the United States could incite war with Cuba. One of their plans suggested inventing, and I quote, well-coordinated incidents in and around Guantanamo. The plan was to make it seem like the United States base was under attack. To make the attack seem credible, Operation Northwoods suggested using rumors and quote-unquote friendly Cubans, starting fires, and of course conducting mock funerals for the quote-unquote victims. Another individual proposed and I quote, a Remember the Maine incident. And of course, this was referring to the USS Maine, which blew up under mysterious circumstances in Havana Harbor in 1898. And to any history buffs out there, it was this historic false flag that gave the United States justification to go to war with Spain. However, the 1962 version of this plan, Operation Northwoods, proposed, and I quote, well, it could be arranged in several forms, And so in these documents they say, and I quote, that the U.S. could, and I quote, blow up a United States ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba, end of quote. However, that is not all. Yes, they also detail how they could blow up an unmanned vessel and then conduct a fake rescue operation. However, once again, that is not all. No, they also detail how they could use the Mockingbird media to their advantage. And I quote, casualty lists in the newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation, end of quote. However, once again, that is not all. A few other suggestions from Operation Northwoods involved developing, and I quote, a communist Cuban terror campaign in Florida and perhaps Washington, D.C. Again, I quote, they had plans to sink a boat of Cuban refugees, real or simulated, end of quote. And then from there, they also detailed plotting public attacks on Cuban refugees, exploding bombs, and planting evidence that suggested that Cuba was plotting an attack in South America. However, perhaps the most ambitious plot in Operation Northwoods involved a civilian airliner. And so this plan proposed, and I quote, orchestrating an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civilian airliner, end of quote. The airline in question could be quote-unquote chartered by fake college students or, and they actually say this in the document, any group of people with a common interest. And they also state that they could convincingly paint it to make it seem real. However, in the end, Operation Northwoods never got further than a memo. That is until 9/11, because it seems very similar, doesn't it? Anyway, according to ABC, President John F. Kennedy told General Leominster directly on March 16, 1962, that he had no plans to use any sort of force to take Cuba. And so, let's get into the denials. The reason that these documents were held secret for so long is that the Joint Chief of Staff never wanted to give these up because they were so embarrassing, end of quote. And so this individual right here, Mr. Bamford, told ABC, and I quote, that Operation Northwoods was one of the most corrupt plans ever created by the U.S. government. And well, that may be the case until recently, very, very recently. But I believe what we're currently living through is going to supersede Operation Northwoods as the most corrupt plan ever devised by the U.S. government. Yes, it is true. I believe what we're living through right now, the Great Reset, the COVID agenda, and everything else dystopian that comes with it. Well, yeah, look, I think this is going to go down as the most corrupt and sinister plan ever created by the U.S. government. And that is saying something. However, I will concede that besides what we're currently living through, Operation Northwoods certainly seems to be at the top of some of the most sinister plans ever devised by the U.S. government. Anyway, they went on to say, and I quote, the whole point of a democracy is to have leaders responding to the public will. And here, well, this is the complete reverse. The military trying to trick the American people into a war that they want, but that nobody else wants, end of quote. And really, if you think about it, ever since the Bushes came into power, well, that kind of seems like the modus operandi of the U.S. government. They, of course, did this with Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, which is very, very similar to their plan for Operation Northwoods. And now, of course, the U.S. establishment is doing it once again, this time with Russia, China, and Ukraine. After all, of course, war equals profits and the establishment of a new world order. Anyway, let's continue. Although most of the key players in Operation Northwoods have since died, John F. Kennedy, of course, was assassinated in November 1963. Those close to the president have flatly denied any knowledge of the anti-Castro plot. And I quote, I've never heard of Operation Northwoods, never heard of it, and don't believe it, Theodore Sorensen, Kennedy's White House special counsel, told the Baltimore Sun in 2001. And I quote again, obviously, it would be totally illegal and as well as totally unwise. And so you have to ask yourself, was there a shadow government beginning to form? Or is this guy lying? I don't know. You decide what you want to believe. And then from there, we have Robert McNamara, who allegedly saw the plan before the president. And he also denies knowing about it. And I quote, I never heard of it. And I quote, I never heard of it, he said. And I quote again, I can't believe the chiefs were talking about or engaged with what I would call CIA-type operations, end of quote. And yeah, I'm pretty sure I don't believe them. And so the legacy of Operation Northwoods is appropriately mysterious. Although it does reflect Cold War tensions and fears about Cuba, it also reveals what methods the American military brass were willing to consider. Had Operation Northwoods succeeded, they noted, and I quote, that the U.S. would have imposed military rule over Cubans. And a general in the U.S. military said, and I quote, "That's what we are supposed to be freeing them from." And I quote again, "The only way that we would have succeeded is by doing exactly what the Russians were doing all over the world, by imposing a government by tyranny." And basically, it's exactly what we accuse Castro himself of doing, end of quote. And yes, the deep state, the administrative state, the intel agencies, the military brass, the U.S. establishment in general, well, they still follow this playbook. Projection. Accuse others of what you are guilty of. And it does seem to me that they took these plans for false flag attacks, dusted them off, and are now using them in the modern era as well. Some things change, and some things never do. And so, I believe it's fair to say that the establishment and the global powers that be, well, they certainly never change. And so stay tuned for the next couple videos. We'll be diving back into our regular content soon, and we'll continue on with this list of historic government conspiracies. However, until next time, once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.